I am part of an organization called NY4HK. I also created my own organization called Project Black Mask, which I will go over later if you guys are interested in, but this is just going over the history of Hong Kong and really what's happened since then. So I like to include these pictures because I think people should see the culture of Hong Kong and understand that although it's quite a westernized place, it's also it has its own culture, and it's very different from China in a lot of ways as well. So there's a lot of partying and a lot of shopping and all of these different things, and it has own its own food and everything like that. So this is the harbor in Hong Kong, probably the most popular place there, and everybody really knows it for this view. So a quote that I really like to go by, and it's something that's in my Instagram bio because I think it really is relevant to what's happening in Hong Kong, is just injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And in Hong Kong, we're seeing all of these things happening, and we see that China's really trying to encroach on the autonomy of Hong Kong. And it leads me to believe that sooner or later, it's going to be the United States as well. You know, China is not just a power that's limited to the Eastern world. It's going to come to the United States. It's going to come to the West, and we have to be prepared for that because, as this quote says, it really is going to affect us. So I don't know if you want to watch this, but I'm just going to summarize it. So Mark Zuckerberg went to Georgetown University around 1 year ago, and he talked about how China, maybe 5 years ago, actually was not, they maybe owned one of the top 10 social media platforms in the United States. And within the last 5 years, it's gone to the top, they've taken over the top 5. So that's really scary because it's showing all of the United States how much China can really seep into our community, and without us knowing, they're really taking over everything and they're spying on us. And you know, that's pretty scary. So a lot of people always ask me, you know, are there any other instances of how China has really infiltrated the United States? And the NBA is a really good example because last year, Daryl Morey spoke out in support of Hong Kong, and he was automatically, you know, reprimanded for having any sort of political opinion. And the NBA really just shut him out, and they said that he had to apologize for what he said. But at the end of the day, you know, he's representing the United States. There's no rules saying that he's not allowed to speak out in support of a pro-democracy movement. So that really puts into perspective how serious China's influence is on the National Basketball Association, which is something that is supposed to be personal to the United States, but somehow because China has such a huge cash flow, they're able to control something that should be specific to us. And South Park did a bit on what's happening in China and Hong Kong, and they were just showing how China has a lot of power when it comes to that, and we really should not let them infiltrate our country. So then we get to everything that's happening in the summer of 2019, and I think you guys have probably all heard of the protests that have been happening in Hong Kong, and I'm just going to briefly go over what happened and why it started. So the biggest reason was because of the Hong Kong-China extradition law, and this was proposed because a Hong Kong resident murdered his pregnant girlfriend in Taiwan and was able to flee back to Hong Kong to avoid being prosecuted. And since there's no extradition agreement between Hong Kong and Taiwan and China, he was not going to get prosecuted unless China created this extradition bill, which they tried to do. And it resulted in a lot of pushback. And the Hong Kongers said, you know, since we were guaranteed 50 years of autonomy, the fact that you're trying to push this extradition bill upon us is causing the loss of democracy and autonomy in Hong Kong. And so when a lot of people ask me, you know, isn't Hong Kong a part of China? Sure, geographically it is. But when it comes to the government and all of the systems that they use, it's completely different. So in 1997, Hong Kong was returned to China under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and they were given autonomy for 50 years. And they were allowed to maintain a capitalist system until 2047. And in 2019, China tried to take over that and tried to say, hey, we're done with this. We just want to go back to having Hong Kong be ours. And This joint declaration really allows Hong Kong to function in the same way that the United States does, with 3 branches and having an independent financial system. And because Hong Kong is just a really huge part of the international economy, it allowed for Hong Kong to kind of, I don't know if you know this, but China actually cannot use its money to do economic business with the United States. So it has to go through Hong Kong in order to accomplish that. So Hong Kong is a really, really big economic center when it comes to our free world and bridging the gap between the China and the United States. Some basic differences between China uses a different currency than Hong Kong. China's government is really, everything is just jumbled together. There's really no separation of power, and it was really important for Hong Kongers to be able to have that kind of separation of power. Chinese citizens have a Chinese passport, while Hong Kongers, a lot of them have either BNOs to Great Britain, or they have their own citizenship in Hong Kong. And there are a lot of different social medias and emails that you can't use in China, while in Hong Kong, we're really allowed to connect with the free world through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever, all of those different things. Hong Kong is really able to use that, while in China, they're not allowed to unless they use VPNs. And same thing here. And so I think this is a really good illustration of really what's happening in the world right now. And China has really knocked on every single door of all of these captive nations, Tibet, including like East Turkestan, East Kazakhstan, those kinds of areas, and they're really trying to take over all of us. And they just knocked on Hong Kong's door this past year, and we're really expecting China to continue to take over the world if we don't try to put a stop to what they're doing and stopping the expansion of their power. So the protest begins they began last year on June 9th, and there were 1 million protesters in Hong Kong that gathered, keyword being peacefully. They were very peaceful, and 1 million people is actually 1/7 of the Hong Kong population right now. And so it really is a really big turnout, because people really do believe in autonomy and democracy for Hong Kong. And the police responded incredibly violently. Oops, sorry guys. The police responded really, really violently to that, and automatically with force and just, tear gas and all of that stuff. And then came the first death of the Hong Kong protests, where one of our freedom fighters fell off of a scaffolding because they were trying to run away from the police, who were brutally trying to hurt them. And so that first death really allowed for the international attention for what was happening in Hong Kong, and we had newspapers all over the world cover the problems that were going on. And at that point in time, G20 was occurring, so a lot of different newspapers, especially in the United States, were covering that. And we had a lot of rich Hong Kong tech moguls and just businessmen in general. They paid for a lot of the ads, and we tried to do a lot of crowdfunding to make sure that the international world knew what was happening. And this is actually one of the first protests that I attended. And you're not going to find me here, but basically what happened was that we held up the newspaper that was published in the New York Times. Oops, sorry. That was published in the New York Times, and it said "Stand with Hong Kong at G20." And it was a really, really special moment for all of us, because a lot of people took photos, and it became a really, really big press event. And you can see in the front, there's a man in the yellow representing the first death of the protests. And we were able to do this in Grand Central and really gain a lot of American support and attention. And a lot of people asked us what was happening. And then we had the second death, and this girl wrote her will in a staircase before jumping off the building. And she really, to summarize, she just really didn't want to live in a world in a Hong Kong that didn't have democracy. And she saw the end of democracy coming, and she just didn't want to do that. And of course, we now always believe that nobody should die because they see the end of it, but we're fighting for it. So, this life was unfortunate to have lost, but we try to remember it and fight for her as well. And so by the time June 12th came around, we had these 5 demands, because the police were being extremely brutal and the government was not responding well at all. So the first demand was the permanent withdrawal of the extradition bill, and the second was the withdrawal of the characterization of June 12th being a riot. And this was really important because these protesters are peacefully protesting, and they shouldn't have been classified as riots, but the police classified them as so, and really put out a lot of propaganda saying that, you know, people were doing all of these really violent acts, though I believe personally that it was really pushed out. These protesters were forced to retaliate because the police were being so violent with them. And the third is the release of arrested protesters without charges. A lot of people were arrested without any logical reasoning, so even now we're still fighting for this. The fourth being independent investigation into the police violence and abuse of power. And we really wanted to make sure that there was a third party that was investigating this, because at that point in time, Hong Kongers were getting this they were getting unfair trials when it came to investigating what was happening. And number 5 is we want the chief executive, Carrie Lam, to step down and implement full universal suffrage. So they were really taking away the rights of Hong Kongers to vote. And we fought for it in 2015, 2017, and you know, the suffrage just kept being granted and then taken away. So this also happened in some of the Black Lives Matters protests, but there used to be numbers on the police uniforms, and then suddenly they were all covered. And I've seen that in New York as well. A lot of the police have put like a little black band around their badges to hide their numbers. So I guess I would say it's because you no longer can identify them, and you don't know who's committing this violent act. And this is actually a photo from 2015, but it's really similar to what's happening now. These protesters they're being shot with a lot of violence and pepper spray and now tear gas bombs. And, you know, I would say that it's really unjustified to hit like these people, a lot of them are civilians. They were just walking by and they were just being attacked because of, you know, walking, I guess. This happened in 2017 as well. This man was he's a member of the press, so you can tell he has a badge on, but even press were being attacked. And you know, press typically, when it comes to events like this, they're not really supposed to be involved in the protests like the police think that they are, but the police were just attacking them. You know, they didn't care who you were, what job you were doing, they were just attacking them. And then, I'm sorry for the quality of this, but this happened on July 21st of 2019, and we had a lot of gang members in Hong Kong wearing white shirts, and they just flew into the train stations and beat up protesters who were going home. And some of them had machetes, and some of them just had like long metal rods, and they were just hurting people. They were just, I can't even describe it. It was just incredible violence. And there's a lot of videos online if you ever want to check that out. You can see here, you know, they're just beating whoever's wearing a black shirt. So black actually represents the protests in Hong Kong. It's a uniform of the protesters. So anybody who was wearing black was automatically targeted for what was happening. And then we had August 31st, 2019, and the train station, so the policemen actually at this train station called Prince Edward Station, they trapped a bunch of young protesters, and we don't know what happened to them. And so even to this day, we're still fighting to try to understand what happened, because they turned off all of the security footage and virtually locked all of these different protesters so in this station, and a lot of people are missing after this day. We're missing after this day, and we're still trying to find out what happened, and we have no true evidence of whether somebody died or was extradited back to China. No idea at all. And so the Hong Kong movement is very youth based. It's youth motivated. All of these young generations, they're trying to fight for something that is their future. So you see a lot of these different protesters were actually all teenagers, or not even teenagers maybe. We had a lot of like 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds come out onto the streets and say, this is our future, this is what we care about. And a lot of the protests actually took place in schools, and they were boycotting going to school to fight for their freedom. And from here on out, it's just a lot of like photos. So this happened last year. A lot of these people are actually in the organization that I work with. But in the center is Nancy Pelosi on her on her left is Nathan Law, and he's one of the freedom fighters. He's actually currently in exile in England, but he's fighting for Hong Kong, and he's working really, really hard. He was in prison for 6 years for participating in protests in early 2015. And on her right is Joshua Wong, and he's probably one of the he's the face of this revolution, and he's really represented the abilities of a lot of, or the motivation behind all of us. He's given up his life and also went to jail with Nathan to fight for the democracy of Hong Kong. And so one of the acts that I was talking about earlier was the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and it was actually passed in 2019 by Congress. It says may pass here, but it was passed, and we were really lucky to have this passed because it really gave us a lot of support from Congress, and we're still fighting for different bills that will be able to assure that the United States will stand behind Hong Kong when it comes time to do so. So these are just a lot of photos of the things that I started doing when I was in New York City I was going into my senior year. So there wasn't a lot that we could do, but in Hong Kong, there are a lot of sentimental things that we do to show support for each other. And one of which is it's these Lennon walls. And it's just a space for Hong Kongers to write post-its on walls and show their support for each other. And we started to do that in New York City to first show what was happening in Hong Kong to American citizens, but also show Hong Kongers that we do really care in the United States. And we did a lot of protesting in New York, and a lot of people really showed up, whether they were American or not. And it was a really, really special moment for all of us. We just had a lot of different events that showed how much people care about Hong Kong. And this event was it was at Astor Place, and we had a band play there. I was in it, but not a lot of people know that. And the yellow helmets represent the uniform of the Hong Kongers as well. They had to wear hard hats because the police would throw a lot of stuff at them. This was a protest that we had in front of Madison Square Garden, where we were actually protesting against the NBA, and the person in the middle with the yellow hat is me. And the poster that I'm holding is actually probably one of my most, the iconic poster that really started it all for me, because it was the first thing that I held when I was protesting for Hong Kong in the United States, and it's become a slogan that we use a lot. And this is me protesting later on in front of the Chinese consulate and becoming more active in everything. And this is most recent. I went to DC this past month, and I was able to meet a lot of congressmen. The top left is Scott Perry, top right is Ted Yoho, and the bottom is Tom Swayze. And they are three men who have really, really supported the Hong Kong movement and have, given us a lot of support in signing different bills and acts, and and ensuring that Hong Kong has really been able to maintain its democracy under the United States eye. So that's the end of my presentation.